In the summer of 1896, inside a massive stone complex called Pueblo Bonito in northwestern New Mexico, archaeologist George H. Pepper and excavator Richard Wetherill began opening rooms that had been sealed by centuries of dust and collapse. What they were entering was not a village in the ordinary sense. Pueblo Bonito had grown over generations into a D-shaped structure 4 to 5 stories high, with more than 600 rooms, ceremonial chambers, storage spaces, plazas, and masonry walls, unlike almost anything else built in the ancient Southwest. Then the excavators reached places where the objects stopped looking local. Tropical birds, marine shell, enormous quantities of turquoise, strange cylindrical jars, human burials accompanied by wealth almost without parallel in the region. More than a century later, laboratories would find traces of cacao inside some of those vessels, and ancient DNA would reveal biological relationships among people buried in one extraordinary crypt. Chaco Canyon had once been described as an isolated desert settlement. The Archaeology tells a much larger story. Between roughly AD 850 and 1250, Chaco became a major center of ancestral Pueblo ceremonial, economic, and political life, linked to communities scattered across the Four Corners and beyond. UNESCO now describes it as an ancient ceremonial center, unlike anything built before or since in the region. And the deeper researchers look, the stranger its scale becomes. Because what was built here required forests that did not grow here, goods that came from hundreds or even thousands of miles away, roads wider than practical footpaths needed to be, astronomical knowledge encoded into architecture, and a social system whose exact nature archaeologists still cannot agree on. Chaco did not merely contain mysteries, Chaco was built on them. You have to understand the landscape before any of this makes sense. Chaco Canyon lies in the high desert of the San Juan Basin, a place of dry washes, sandstone cliffs, violent summer storms, freezing winters, and limited local timber. Yet between the 9th and 12th centuries, ancestral Pueblo communities transformed this difficult environment into the center of a regional system. The National Park Service identifies 13 major prehistoric sites inside the canyon and hundreds of smaller ones, while Chacoan-style great houses appear at more than 150 locations across the wider region. Some were connected by engineered roads. Many structures were oriented toward cardinal directions or solar and lunar events. Pueblo Bonito alone became a monumental architectural project that took decades and generations to complete. Imagine standing there 1,000 years ago. No trucks, no steel tools, no draft animals, no wheeled freight system, and yet enormous quantities of stone, wood, food, pottery, turquoise, birds, shells, and ceremonial objects were moving toward this canyon. Quick second, if this kind of investigation is landing for you, hit subscribe. It costs you 1 click, and it helps me keep making deep dives where the archaeology is stranger than the legends. Back to Chaco, the first discovery. This was not just a village. When Pepper and Wetherill began the hide exploring expedition at Pueblo Bonito in 1896, they entered room after room, expecting the material remains of a large ancestral settlement. Instead, the architecture itself became the first anomaly. Pueblo Bonito was monumental. Its final form contained more than 600 rooms, rose several stories high, and included numerous kivas, the circular structures associated with ceremonial and communal activity. The National Park Service today describes the building as a center for ceremony, administration, trade, storage, hospitality, communication, astronomy, and the burial of honored dead. That combination is important because ordinary farming villages usually leave ordinary residential evidence: hearths, trash, repeated domestic occupation, burials distributed in predictable patterns. Chaco's great houses are harder to classify. Current National Park Service interpretation explicitly says they may not have been conventional villages occupied by large permanent populations at all. They may instead have been monumental public architecture used periodically when people converged for ceremonies, exchange, and gatherings. That uncertainty changes everything. If Pueblo Bonito was not simply an apartment block, what was it? A ceremonial capital, a pilgrimage center, a political headquarters, a storage and redistribution complex. Archaeologists have argued versions of all of those possibilities, and no single model explains every feature. The canyon contains grandeur without a written constitution, hierarchy without a surviving royal title, public works without any document saying who ordered them, no king list, no tax records, no construction orders. Not a single line of writing explaining why generations kept expanding these enormous buildings. The structure is still standing right now, and the question is still open. The second discovery. The forest was missing. Archaeologists examining the roofs and construction timbers at Chaco faced a basic problem almost immediately. The canyon could not have supplied the wood needed to build its great houses. Thousands upon thousands of beams had once supported ceilings and upper stories, many of them ponderosa pine. Researchers eventually estimated that Chacoan great house construction consumed on the order of 200,000 to 240,000 trees. But when scientists looked at the surrounding landscape, the source forest simply was not there. The breakthrough came from tree rings. Christopher Gitterman and colleagues compared archaeological timbers with regional tree ring chronologies and published the results in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Their analysis showed that roughly 70% of the timbers they studied most likely came from the Chusca and Zuni mountains, more than 75 kilometers, about 47 miles, from Chaco. The procurement pattern also changed through time. Before roughly AD 1020, much of the wood appears to have come from the Zuni mountains. Afterward, the Chusca mountains became increasingly important. Imagine the discovery in reverse. A worker cuts a heavy pine trunk high in a mountain forest. The branches are removed. Then that beam has to cross tens of miles of broken high desert terrain before it becomes part of a ceiling at Pueblo Bonito. There were no horses pulling wagons, no oxen, no wheeled carts. Human beings moved it. Modern science can tell us where much of the wood came from. It still cannot tell us exactly how labor was organized on this scale. How many people participated, what obligations brought them into the project, or why the effort was sustained for generations. That missing administrative machinery is one of Chaco's deepest absences. The wood is there, the roads are there, the buildings are there. The command structure is invisible. The third discovery. The roads were too wide. Once archaeologists began surveying beyond individual ruins, they started noticing long, unnaturally straight corridors extending from Chacoan sites across the desert. Aerial photography and ground survey revealed a road system that connected the canyon to a huge regional network. The National Park Service describes more than 400 miles of prehistoric roads, linking dozens of great houses in Chaco Canyon with more than 150 great houses across the broader landscape. Some of those roads were as much as 30 feet wide. That is where the practical explanation starts to break down. In a society without wheeled vehicles or large pack animals, a 30-foot wide road is difficult to justify as a simple transportation lane. The Park Service says this directly: there is no obvious practical requirement for roads that broad, and the labor invested suggests that at least some routes may have served ceremonial purposes. Experiments do show that walking on preserved Chacoan road surfaces can require less energy than crossing adjacent rough terrain, so the routes could absolutely have helped move people and goods. But usefulness does not explain their full scale. Walk the Pueblo Alto Trail today, and you can still encounter traces of Chacoan roads, ramps and stairways cut into the landscape. Think about the discovery moment for the first surveyors who realized that one straight segment was not an isolated path, then found another, until a regional geometry began appearing across the basin. What were the builders connecting? Communities, sacred places, pilgrimage routes, political territories? The roads survive. Their instructions do not. The fourth discovery. Tropical birds reached the desert. During the excavation of Pueblo Bonito and other Chacoan sites, archaeologists uncovered the remains of scarlet macaws, birds whose natural range lies far to the south in tropical and subtropical regions. These were not local animals that happened to wander into New Mexico. They had been transported through long-distance exchange systems. The surprise became much sharper when radiocarbon dating was applied directly to macaw remains. A 2015 study led by Adam Watson demonstrated that scarlet macaws were reaching Chaco during much of the period between approximately AD 911-50, meaning the exchange network existed earlier and lasted longer than some previous models had assumed. Then genetics pushed the question further. Researchers analyzed ancient DNA from Chacoan scarlet macaws to investigate their geographic origins and biological relationships. The work confirmed that these birds belonged to populations with deep connections to Mesoamerica. Imagine the last stage of that journey: a living scarlet macaw, bright red against the muted New Mexico desert, arriving at a stone complex hundreds of miles beyond its natural world. Somebody had fed it, protected it, transferred it from person to person, and carried it north. The National Park Service notes that exotic macaws and specialized cylindrical vessels are associated specifically with great houses rather than ordinary small house contexts. That suggests controlled access, ritual meaning, or status, but archaeologists still debate exactly what the birds represented. Were they diplomatic gifts, sacred beings, symbols of distant places, evidence of elite authority? The bones prove the journey. They do not tell us why the journey mattered. The fifth discovery. Chocolate was already here. The strange cylindrical jars from Pueblo Bonito had bothered archaeologists for decades. In the late 19th century, excavators recovered 111 of them from a single room. Their shape was unusual, and vessels of this type were concentrated overwhelmingly at Pueblo Bonito. For more than a century, nobody could say with confidence what they had contained. Then Patricia Crown and W. Jeffrey Hurst tested microscopic residues preserved inside pottery fragments. In 2009, they reported the chemical signature of cacao. That result pushed Chaco's connections astonishingly far south. Cacao does not grow naturally in New Mexico. It requires warm tropical environments. The residues demonstrated cacao consumption in the American Southwest around AD 1000 to 1125, the earliest confirmed evidence then known north of the Mexican border. Picture someone 1,000 years ago lifting one of those cylindrical jars inside Pueblo Bonito. The drink inside began with a plant grown far to the south, moved through networks that crossed linguistic, ecological, and political boundaries before reaching a high desert ceremonial center. The discovery did not answer the biggest question. It created it. How direct was the connection? Did Chacoan travelers reach Mesoamerica, or did cacao pass through multiple intermediary communities? Was it rare ceremonial medicine, elite food, sacred drink, or something else? Archaeology can detect theobromine molecules. It cannot reconstruct the conversation that took place when the cacao changed hands. The chemistry survived. The meaning did not. The sixth discovery. The sky was built into stone. In 1977, artist Anna Sofer was on Fajada Butte while helping document rock art when she recognized an extraordinary interaction between sunlight, 3 stone slabs, and spiral petroglyphs. At summer solstice, a narrow blade of sunlight crosses the center of the larger spiral. At other points in the solar cycle, shifting light and shadow interact differently with the carvings. The feature became known as the sun dagger. The implications reached beyond one petroglyph. Researchers began testing whether great houses themselves reflected solar, lunar, or cardinal directions. The National Park Service now states that many Chacoan buildings were oriented to solar, lunar, and cardinal directions, while the canyon also contains astronomical markers and alignments. Some proposed astronomical relationships remain more debated than others, especially the more elaborate lunar alignment theories. That distinction matters. The sun dagger's solar behavior is widely documented. Not every claimed alignment across the Chaco landscape has the same level of scholarly acceptance. And that leaves an eerie problem. The builders had no surviving written astronomical tables. Yet architecture and rock art suggest careful observation repeated over long periods. An 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, if intentionally tracked in some Chacoan features, would require observations extending beyond a single annual calendar. The science shows that celestial patterning mattered. It cannot recover the full knowledge system that explained why. The sky still moves exactly as it did 1,000 years ago. The stone markers remain. The interpretation is incomplete. The seventh discovery. A family may have held power for centuries. In one of Pueblo Bonito's most famous spaces, Room 33, excavators found a burial crypt containing 14 individuals. The treatment of these dead was extraordinary compared with most known burials in the region. One man had been buried with more than 11,000 turquoise beads, and the room as a whole contained an exceptional concentration of valuable objects. For decades, archaeologists argued over what this meant. Was this evidence of hereditary elites, ritual specialists, clan leadership? Something else entirely. Then ancient DNA changed the conversation. In 2017, Douglas Kennett and an interdisciplinary team analyzed genetic material from 9 individuals in the crypt. Their mitochondrial DNA indicated that all 9 shared the same maternal lineage, and nuclear DNA identified specific close relationships among several individuals. The lineage persisted across roughly 330 years. That was a major discovery because it suggested that social status connected to this burial group could have passed through the maternal line. But even here, the evidence has boundaries. Ancient DNA can show biological relationships. It cannot by itself define political office, religious authority, inheritance rules, or how living Pueblo peoples understood those relationships. Researchers continue to debate how hierarchical Chaco was. The National Park Service itself presents competing models, from relatively egalitarian clan-based organization to more stratified political systems. The bodies tell us they were related. The turquoise tells us they were treated differently. What kind of power they held remains unresolved. The eighth discovery. Turquoise came in staggering quantities. During the 19th century excavation of Pueblo Bonito, workers began uncovering beads, pendants, ornaments, unfinished pieces, and manufacturing debris made from turquoise. Then they reached the extraordinary burial contexts, and the scale changed completely. Thousands upon thousands of pieces had been concentrated around particular individuals. Room 33 alone contained quantities that stunned the original excavators, including more than 12,000 turquoise objects reported from the burial assemblage. Turquoise occurs in the southwest, but chemical and sourcing studies have shown that Chacoans acquired raw material through broad exchange networks rather than relying on one nearby deposit. The Park Service describes large amounts of raw turquoise, ornaments, offerings, and workshop debris within the canyon, and openly asks whether Chaco operated as a turquoise-centered exchange hub involved in acquiring macaws, copper bells, shells, and other distant prestige goods. This is where absence becomes powerful. No surviving ledger records who owned the turquoise. No text tells us whether a bead was money, prayer, lineage marker, diplomatic gift, or sacred substance. No merchant account lists the exchange rate between turquoise and cacao. The physical economy is visible. The conceptual economy is gone. If some people could accumulate thousands of pieces while others were buried with little, what exactly created that inequality? The ninth discovery. Chaco reached both coasts of another world. As excavations continued, the imported materials became harder to dismiss as isolated curiosities. Marine shells appeared in an inland desert. Copper bells pointed south toward technologies associated with Mesoamerica. Macaws came from tropical zones. Cacao came from environments where chocolate-producing plants could grow. The National Park Service summarizes these objects as evidence of far-reaching exchange during Chaco's fluorescence, and specifically identifies seashells, macaws, copper bells, and cacao among the imported materials. Imagine laying those objects on a table without labels. A shell that began near an ocean, a copper bell made through a metallurgical tradition not native to Chaco Canyon, a tropical bird, a cacao-stained vessel. Then place that table inside a stone building in a cold, arid basin more than 6,000 feet above sea level. Every object represents a chain of human movement, but archaeology has not uncovered a single Chacoan marketplace with written signs, standardized coins, merchant contracts, or preserved shipping instructions. That does not mean exchange was primitive. It means the mechanism remains difficult to reconstruct. Were goods moving through commerce, gifting, pilgrimage, marriage alliances, tribute, ritual exchange, or combinations of all of them? The geographic reach is documented. The political meaning of that reach is not. The 10th discovery. The population may have been smaller than the buildings suggest. This is one of the strangest reversals in Chaco archaeology. Early visitors saw huge structures and naturally imagined huge resident populations. Pueblo Bonito looks like a city block built in stone. But as archaeologists compared the architecture with domestic debris, hearths, burials, food processing evidence, and room use, another possibility emerged. Some great houses may have hosted far fewer permanent residents than their room counts imply. The National Park Service now openly explains that Chaco's great houses may not have been ordinary farming villages at all. They may have functioned as public buildings, occupied intermittently during ceremonies, trade events, or large gatherings. That interpretation turns architectural scale on its head. Hundreds of rooms do not necessarily equal hundreds of households. Some rooms could have held stored food, ritual objects, visiting groups, or goods arriving from distant communities. The discovery moment here was not one dramatic shovel strike. It was the slow realization that something expected was missing. Not enough domestic signatures, not enough everyday evidence to make the simplest urban model work comfortably. This is T4, absence as evidence, at its strongest. If thousands of people did not permanently live inside the great houses, then who built them? Who maintained them? Where did visitors stay when major gatherings occurred? And what institution was important enough to persuade dispersed farming communities to invest labor in monumental buildings they may have used only periodically? Archaeologists have models. They do not have a final answer. The 11th discovery. Chaco did not simply vanish. By the middle of the 12th century, something was changing. Major new construction slowed. The canyon's role as the center of the regional system weakened. Influence continued at places such as Aztec ruins, Mesa Verde, and communities in the Chusca Mountains, while people reorganized and moved through the broader southwest. By the 1200s, the political and ceremonial world centered on Chaco had changed profoundly. For older popular histories, this became a disappearing civilization story. Archaeology and living Pueblo traditions tell a different one. The people did not evaporate. Their descendants are among the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest today, and many communities preserve migration histories and cultural connections to Chaco. The National Park Service explicitly describes Chaco as a place remembered along sacred migration paths and emphasizes that descendant communities regard the canyon as spiritually significant. That does not mean the transition is completely understood. Environmental stress, changing rainfall, resource pressure, social transformation, migration, and shifts in political or ceremonial authority have all entered archaeological explanations. But no single surviving document announces, "This is why Chaco changed." There was no final evacuation notice carved into Pueblo Bonito, no last ruler's inscription, no written date saying the system ended here. Instead, archaeologists see construction slowing, networks transforming, people moving, traditions continuing elsewhere. The canyon became quieter, but the culture did not end. And that may be the most important discovery of all. Because when you put these 11 pieces together, Chaco Canyon stops looking like an isolated archaeological curiosity and starts looking like evidence of a sophisticated indigenous world that older versions of American history badly underestimated. Monumental buildings rose in a desert basin. Timber traveled more than 75 kilometers from distant mountain forests. Hundreds of miles of engineered roads crossed the landscape. Tropical macaws arrived alive from far to the south. Cacao reached Pueblo Bonito around 1,000 years ago. Marine shell and copper moved through continental exchange systems. Turquoise accumulated in quantities suggesting ritual value and social distinction. Astronomical observations were embedded into monuments and rock art. A biologically related burial group persisted across centuries. Great houses may have served regional gatherings rather than ordinary domestic populations. And when Chaco's influence shifted, its people did not disappear. Communities reorganized, migrated, and continued traditions that survive among Pueblo peoples today. What is remarkable is how much evidence still exists. You can stand at Pueblo Bonito today. You can walk through rooms built 1,000 years ago. You can look across the canyon toward roads whose purpose remains debated. The museum collections still hold macaw bones, turquoise, pottery, and objects recovered in the 19th and 20th centuries. Tree rings still preserve the history of forests carried across the basin. Molecules trapped in ceramic pores still record a drink brought from another climate. DNA recovered from ancient burials has revealed relationships invisible to the original excavators. And overhead, the sun and moon continue tracing the same cycles the builders watched. But the closer science gets to Chaco, the more precise the mystery becomes. We no longer need to ask whether these people were capable of large-scale planning, long-distance exchange, astronomical observation, or sophisticated social organization. The evidence has already answered that. The harder question is what kind of world they were building. Was Chaco primarily sacred, political, economic, or all three at once? Were its roads meant for travelers, ceremonies, processions, heavy loads, or symbolic connections between communities? Who organized the timber crews? Who controlled the cacao and macaws? Why were certain people buried beneath Pueblo Bonito with thousands of turquoise objects, while most others were not? What did the great houses mean to the families who walked dozens of miles to reach them? Archaeologists can measure walls to the centimeter and date beams to individual years, yet the human meaning behind those measurements remains only partly recoverable. That is why Chaco Canyon matters. It does not rewrite Native American history by replacing one myth with another. It rewrites it by forcing us to abandon the old assumption that complexity in ancient North America had to look European, urban in the modern sense, or dependent on writing and metal technology to be extraordinary. Chaco followed its own logic. Its builders created something adapted to their landscape, their beliefs, their communities, and their understanding of the world. And 1,000 years later, we are still trying to understand the design. So when you look at Pueblo Bonito, are you looking at the ruins of a city, a sanctuary, a political capital, a gathering place, or something our modern categories are simply too narrow to describe? Share this video with someone who loves hidden history and tell me in the comments which discovery at Chaco Canyon changes the way you see ancient America the most.